The train platform at Bremerhaven was crowded with soldiers. October 1958. Elvis Aaron Presley stood among 3,000 other men in olive drab, watching the German shore materialize like a photograph developing in water. Salt spray hit his face, cold and sharp. He didn't know it yet, but the next 18 months would teach him something Hollywood never could: how to be nobody again. His sergeant barked orders. The machinery of the U.S. Army moved around him with the precision of a clock. Tick, tick. Footsteps echoed off the metal dock. Elvis had expected confusion, resentment, the weight of being the king displaced. Instead he found something stranger: relief. For the first time in 3 years, his name meant almost nothing to the men around him. Not here. Not yet. Just another private. Just another body in formation. Look at what he was thinking then. But maybe fame was a sickness he could finally cure. The barracks were freezing. Thin walls. Radiator that clanked like a drum at 3 in the morning. Elvis lay on his bunk, listening to the rhythm of it, and something loosened in his chest. No photographers. No Colonel Parker checking his watch. No mothers screaming outside his window. Just the sound of men breathing in the dark, all of them equally nothing. Wait. Here's where it gets interesting. He'd never experienced this before. Invisibility felt like oxygen. First week. A soldier named Marcus from Kentucky noticed him at breakfast. Not recognized him. Actually looked at him. Really looked. "You're from Memphis?" Marcus asked, and Elvis nodded. "Yeah," Elvis said. "I'm from Memphis too," and that was it. The conversation ended. Marcus didn't ask for autographs or stories. He just acknowledged the geography and moved on. Elvis felt something crack open inside him. This was what normal felt like. By the 3rd week, he'd begun to understand the rhythm of the base. Bad Nauheim was small, nestled in the Taunus Hills, and the routine was mechanical. Wake at 6, formation at 6:30, assignments by 7. Elvis was assigned to the 1st Armored Division as a regular soldier. Not a special assignment, not a morale officer. He drove trucks. He stood guard. He cleaned weapons. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who'd sold more records than any musician alive was now responsible for inventory checks and latrine maintenance. It was, somehow, the most honest work he'd ever done. Notice what shifted in him, that first moment when he realized dignity and obscurity might be the same thing. Then he saw her. It was late afternoon, around 4 o'clock. The light was already fading. Almania, Germany, didn't have the kind of light Memphis had. It was softer, grayer, like living inside a photograph that hadn't quite developed. Elvis walked into the officers' club to pick up paperwork for his sergeant. The room smelled like beer and cigarette smoke, and something else. Polish, maybe. Leather chairs. The careful smell of American privilege maintained in a foreign land. And behind the counter, managing a stack of vinyl records, was a woman. Her name was Margaret. She was 24 years old. Dark hair, straightened and practical. A face that had decided early on not to be impressed by much. She wore a grey dress. Nothing fancy. And her hands moved with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage chaos through repetition. German efficiency meeting American disorder. She was concentrating so hard on the records that she didn't look up when Elvis entered. He stood there for a moment. Just stood there. Watching her work was like watching someone solve a puzzle. She'd pick up a record, check the label against a list, slide it into the right slot. Check. Next. Check. Next. There was a rhythm to it. A certainty. Something he'd lost the ability to recognize. "I'm looking for paperwork," Elvis said. His voice sounded strange in his own ears. Smaller somehow. She looked up. For 1 second. Just one. Her expression flickered. Recognition. But she didn't let it land. Her face went neutral, professional, the way people's faces do when they're making a decision not to be impressed. "What kind of paperwork?" she asked in English. Accented, careful. "For Lieutenant Harris." "Equipment logs." "1 moment." She turned back to the records. Didn't rush. Finished checking 2 more. Then she walked to a filing cabinet and returned with a folder. She handed it to him. Their fingers didn't touch. "Here," she said. "Thanks," Elvis said. She was already turning back to the records. But something had changed. He could feel it, a shift in the room's temperature maybe. Or maybe just in him. Over the next 3 months, Elvis found reasons to be at the officers' club. New reasons at first. Legitimate reasons. Paperwork pickups. A broken phonograph that needed examination. Records that needed to be catalogued because there'd been a mix-up in the filing system. Then, as the reasons became thinner, he stopped pretending to have them. He'd just show up, 15 minutes before his shift ended, and sit in a corner with a book he wasn't reading, listening to Margaret negotiate with other soldiers about what music should play at the Friday night dances. She was efficient with everyone. But Elvis noticed something. She was kind to people others ignored. A young private with a stutter who came in to request a specific song. An older sergeant who was clearly homesick. To these people, Margaret gave her full attention. She didn't rush them, but to the officers, to the men who came in acting important and self-satisfied, she was polite and distant, professional, cold. One evening in late November, she directly acknowledged his presence. It happened without warning. Elvis was sitting in his usual corner, and she walked over with a cup of coffee. "You like coffee?" she asked. "Not why are you always here? Not can I help you? Just do you like coffee?" "Yeah," Elvis said. "I do. It's not good coffee," she said. "But it's warm. That's something." She set it down and walked away before he could respond. He held the cup in his hands and felt something break open. Not romance. Not yet. Just the shock of being seen as a person who might want coffee. After that, conversations happened naturally. She'd bring him coffee around 5 o'clock, when the rush was over, and she had 5 minutes. They talked about stupid things. The weather, the food in the cafeteria, what she read in her spare time, German novels mostly, and some English mysteries. What he read, westerns, comic books, books about philosophy, that he half understood. She asked him questions the way you'd ask anyone. "Why do you come here so often?" Not accusatory, just curious. "Seemed better than being in the barracks," Elvis said. "Because of the other soldiers?" "No," Elvis said. "Because you don't act like I'm special." Margaret set down the cup of coffee she was holding. The ceramic made a soft sound against the wooden table. "I recognize you," she said. Her eyes met his. "I just don't care. There's a difference." That honesty. Wait. Listen to what happened because of that honesty. It changed something in him, that admission. That you could recognize someone and choose not to be impressed anyway. It was the most generous thing anyone had done for him in years. They began to spend time together outside the club. December evenings walking through the cold town. Bad Nauheim had a particular beauty in winter. The buildings were old, some dating back centuries, and the snow made everything look like a postcard of somewhere else. They'd walk past families through window glass, all of them lit up like scenes in a play. Elvis and Margaret would watch for a moment, then move on. "Do you miss it?" Margaret asked him once. They were standing near a bakery, warmth leaking out through the door when people entered. "Miss what?" "Your life. Before this." Elvis thought about that. "I don't know," he said. "I think I miss who I was before I became who I was supposed to be. Does that make sense?" "No," Margaret said. "But I understand it anyway." They talked about his mother. That came out slowly, over days, how Gladys had died just 4 years ago. And sometimes Elvis would feel her absence like a physical thing, like something was missing from his chest. How he'd kept working, kept performing, because stopping felt like betraying her memory. How he'd never had time to actually grieve. Margaret listened. She didn't offer platitudes. She didn't say she's in a better place, or time heals all wounds. She just sat with the fact of his sadness, and didn't try to fix it. That was its own kind of mercy. Notice what he was learning. That sometimes the greatest intimacy is just being allowed to feel bad without someone trying to make it better. By January, they were spending 3 or 4 evenings a week together. Nothing sexual, nothing dramatic. Just two people figuring out whether they actually wanted to know each other. Stripped of all the machinery that usually surrounded him. They'd sit in quiet rooms and talk. They'd walk in the cold until their hands hurt. They'd listen to records together and sometimes not speak for an hour. But underneath it, there was tension. Not conflict. Tension the way a rope has tension, pulled from both ends, holding against the weight. Margaret understood something that Elvis was still learning. This had an expiration date. She was German. She lived in Germany. He was American. And eventually his time here would end. That knowledge lived between them. Unspoken but present, like furniture in a room. You walked around it, acknowledged its existence through your movements, but didn't talk about the fact that it was there. Then in early February, Everything became visible. A magazine arrived at the base, some American publication. The cover had a photograph of Elvis, not a publicity shot. They'd have approved those. This was candid, him in his uniform, unguarded, caught mid-laugh with another soldier. The caption read, "The King serves, Elvis takes orders like any soldier," and underneath, inside, the secret of Elvis's popularity. Margaret saw it before Elvis did. She found it in the officers' club and left it on the table where he usually sat. She didn't mention it, didn't point it out, just left it there, open to the photograph. When Elvis found it, his stomach went cold. The invisibility had been an illusion. He'd brought the machinery with him, whether he wanted to or not. The photograph proved it. He was never just a person, even here, even in Germany, even with this woman who said she didn't care. Wait, look at what she was trying to tell him. That night when he saw her, Margaret was different. Not hostile, just distant, the way people get when they're reconsidering something they thought they understood. "I can't compete with that," she said. She didn't even look at him. She was organizing records, moving them from one place to another, the same record sometimes, just to have something to do with her hands. Compete with what? Elvis asked, though he knew. With him. She gestured vaguely toward the place where the magazine was. With whoever that person is, the one they're writing about. I'm not fighting that. I'm not built for that kind of fight. Margaret, in 6 months you're going to leave Germany. You're going to get back to Memphis or Hollywood or wherever they want you, and I'm going to stay here. What happens to us then? Do I wait? Do I pretend this was something other than what it was? We could. We could what? You could call. I could visit. I'm German, Elvis. Even if I wanted to follow you to America, they wouldn't let me easily. And you wouldn't want that anyway. You'd want your life back. The one with the photographers and the magazines and the people screaming your name, and I'd become the girl you left behind, and eventually you'd remember me less and less until I was just a story you sometimes told people about Germany. Elvis had no answer to that because she was right. He knew she was right. I like you, Margaret said. Her voice was softer now, and that made it harder. I like you because you're here, because for a few hours at a time, you're just a person. You're not the king. You're not famous. You're just someone who reads westerns and misses his mother and doesn't know how to talk about his feelings, so you talk about everything else instead. I like that person. But the moment you go back to being the symbol, that ends, and it will, because that's your real life, and this is just a station you're passing through. You don't know that, Elvis said, but his voice was hollow. Yes, I do, Margaret said, because I know how the world works. I'm not young. I'm not naive. I'm German. I watched my country fall apart. I understand that people don't stay where they're supposed to leave, and you're supposed to leave. The relationship didn't end all at once. It dissolved like sugar in rain over the next month. They saw each other less. When they did, the ease was gone. They'd sit in silence more often. Margaret would ask him about his day, and he'd tell her, but the conversation felt like they were reading from a script someone else had written. Elvis tried to fight it. He proposed leaving the army early. He talked about staying in Germany, about finding work there, maybe in music, maybe just a regular job. Margaret listened to all of it with kindness and a fundamental refusal to believe it. You're going to meet someone, she told him one afternoon in early March. The snow was melting. The world was turning muddy and grey. Someone younger, someone who will see you as an adventure instead of a responsibility, someone who hasn't lived enough yet to know that this kind of thing ends. And you're going to forget about this, about me, and that's going to be okay. That's how love works sometimes. It's real while it's happening. It teaches you something real, and then it ends, and you carry it with you, and you become a different person because of it. That's the actual gift. Not forever, just the change. Elvis wanted to argue. He wanted to promise something, but he knew she was right. He'd always known she was right. By late March, Elvis had begun noticing one of the other soldiers' friends, a girl named Priscilla. Younger, much younger, 14 years old, though she looked older. American, living with her family on base. She looked at Elvis the way he'd become accustomed to people looking at him, like he was impossible, like he was a dream that had taken human form. It was everything Margaret had warned him about. The inevitability of it almost made him laugh. Almost, but nothing was funny anymore. He didn't pursue it. Not consciously, but he stopped trying to save things with Margaret. The relationship ended not with a fight or a dramatic goodbye, but with a slow fading. By April they barely spoke. By May Margaret had been transferred to another base liaison position, somewhere near Frankfurt. By June she was gone, and Elvis was alone with the knowledge of what he'd lost, or rather what he'd allowed to slip through his fingers, because he understood, finally, that holding on would only hurt her more. What he carried from Margaret was different from heartbreak. It was something worse, in a way. It was knowledge. For the first time, Elvis understood that his fame wasn't just a barrier to connection. It was a fundamentally different thing than he was. You could love the symbol, you could love the person, but the two rarely occupied the same space. And people who tried to love both usually ended up loving neither. That realization would haunt him in different forms for the rest of his life. It was the most important thing anyone ever taught him, and it cost him the one person who mattered enough to teach it. Listen to what happened next, because this is where the real story begins. In his remaining months in Germany, Elvis would sometimes return to the officers' club, looking for her. But she was truly gone. He asked the other staff if they knew where she'd transferred to, but they didn't know, or wouldn't tell him. Eventually, he stopped asking. There was no point. She'd made her choice deliberately, and he had to respect that choice, even though respecting it broke something inside him. He threw himself into his work, drove trucks, stood guard shifts that lasted until his hands went numb, cleaned weapons until they gleamed. The physical repetition of it was comforting. It didn't require him to think, it didn't require him to feel, and for a few hours at a time, that felt like mercy. Other soldiers noticed the change. "You okay, Presley?" they'd ask, and Elvis would say yes, and they'd accept that because they were soldiers, and soldiers understood that some things didn't need to be talked about. Some things just needed to be endured. The unit took care of its own. They didn't ask questions, they just let him work. One night in April, Elvis was alone in the barracks. Most of the other men were at the club or had weekend passes to nearby towns. The radiator was clanking its familiar rhythm, that metallic percussion that had become the soundtrack to his loneliness. 3 in the morning. Or maybe 4. Time felt different now. Slower. Heavier. He lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling, and thought about what Margaret had said, that he was just a station she was passing through, that nothing could change the fundamental fact of who he was and what he'd become. The wool blanket scratched against his skin. Everything in the barracks scratched. Nothing was soft. Nothing was comfortable. That was part of the appeal, he supposed. Pain was honest. Pain didn't lie or pretend. Pain just was what it was. He could respect that. And Margaret was right. He understood that now with a clarity that was almost painful. The invisibility of those first weeks had been a trick. A beautiful, temporary trick. The machinery had followed him all along. It was woven into him so deeply that he couldn't separate it from himself anymore. He was the symbol. The person was just a fading echo underneath, something that only appeared when no one was watching, and sometimes not even then. He thought about the photograph in the magazine. His face mid-laugh with another soldier, the caption, "The King serves," as if being king was something you could put on and take off like a uniform, as if it wasn't the actual fabric of who he was now. The soldiers around him in that photograph, they were looking at him, even if the photo had caught them looking away. That's how it worked. People always looked, whether they realized they were doing it or not. The machinery noticed everything. It recorded everything. It turned everything into proof. He tried to explain this to Margaret once, late in their relationship. He tried to articulate how exhausting it was to be constantly observed, constantly interpreted, constantly turned into a symbol. "But you chose this," she'd said, not unkindly. "You wanted to be famous." "I wanted to sing," Elvis had said. "I never wanted any of the rest." "And now you can't have one without the other," Margaret had replied. "So you have to decide, do you want the singing more than you want to be a person?" He'd never answered that question. He still didn't know the answer. Wait, here's the thing that breaks you about this kind of knowledge. Once you understand it, you can never unknow it. Every relationship after that is haunted by it. Every person who looks at you with love is suspect. Are they loving you, or are they loving the idea of you? Are they seeing a person, or are they seeing a legend? Are they choosing you, or are they choosing what they think you represent? And the worst part is knowing that sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes the person doesn't have the mercy that Margaret had. Sometimes they hold on anyway, and both of you suffer because of it. Margaret understood something most people never grasp, that love sometimes means letting go, that the greatest kindness isn't always presence. Sometimes it's absence. Sometimes it's stepping back and saying, I care about you too much to watch you destroy yourself trying to be two things at once. When she left, she didn't leave him a note. She didn't try to explain. She just disappeared from the officers' club one day. No forwarding address. No way to reach her. Just gone. And Elvis understood. Maybe not immediately, but eventually, that this was an act of mercy. She was making it impossible for him to hold on. She was protecting both of them by making the break clean and final. By June 1960, Elvis's time in Germany was ending. He'd served his 18 months. The army was releasing him back to civilian life, back to Memphis, back to Colonel Parker, back to the machinery. When his service ended, Elvis stood on the same platform in Bremerhaven, where he'd arrived. The ocean looked the same. The machinery of the military moved around him with the same precision. Tick, tick, tick. But he was different now. The invisibility was gone. The magazines had found him even in the one place he'd hoped to lose it. The fame had found him even in the one place he'd thought was safe. And he'd had to give it up anyway, not because he chose to, but because the person who saw him clearly had decided that clarity was a mercy, only if she removed herself from the equation. The realization hurt. It still hurts. He never saw Margaret again. Not in person. Never heard her voice. Never got a letter, or a postcard, or a message through someone else. She'd made the clean break that mercy sometimes requires. She'd removed herself completely, and Elvis had to accept that as an act of kindness, even though accepting it meant accepting that he'd lost something real. Notice what this taught him, that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who leave. Years later, when people asked him about his time in the army, he'd talk about the discipline, the character building, the importance of serving his country, all of which was true. He was proud of his service. He'd learned things there, things about himself, things about what he could endure, things about what it meant to be ordinary, things about the difference between being seen and being known. But he never mentioned the German girl who taught him that fame was a poor substitute for being known. That lesson, unlike his records, didn't belong in interviews or public record. It belonged to the quiet, ordinary part of himself that he'd learned to protect, the part that Margaret had briefly seen, and then, out of mercy perhaps, released back into privacy. Years later still, historians tried to find her. They dug through records, interviewed people who'd been stationed at Bad Nauheim, tried to reconstruct the story piece by piece. But Margaret had lived quietly and died quietly, and by the time people cared enough to look, she'd already chosen not to be found. There were rumors. Some people claimed her name was actually Margot. Others said she was Swedish, not German. A few insisted she'd been an officer's secretary, not a club worker. The details blurred. The story became myth. The person became a legend about a legend, which is how all the best stories end, not with clarity, but with mystery. But Elvis knew the truth. He carried it with him always, like a stone in his pocket. And in his most honest moments, the ones that usually came late at night, when he was alone with a drink and the weight of his own legend, he understood what Margaret had understood, that the story belonged to him, not to the world. But sometimes the most important people in your life are the ones nobody ever hears about. But sometimes the greatest love isn't about forever. It's about allowing someone to be human in a world determined to make them legendary. That sometimes recognition is cruelest when it's accurate. That sometimes the people who save you are the ones who let you go. The irony of his life was that everyone knew Elvis Presley, but the people who'd actually known him, really known him, were few. And nearly all of them, like Margaret, had eventually stepped away. Because you can't hold on to someone who's become a symbol. You can only watch them leave, and be grateful you saw them when they were still a person. That's what the 18 months in Germany taught him. That's what he carried for the rest of his life. That's the story that shaped every relationship that came after. Because once you know what it feels like to be seen clearly, you can never be satisfied with being looked at. And once someone shows you what mercy looks like, you spend the rest of your life measuring everyone else against that standard, and finding them wanting, not because they're lacking, but because they never had the courage to leave. And that's what nobody knows, not because it's secret, but because it matters too much to be made into something public. Because some knowledge is only true if it remains private. Because sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the mercy of leaving you with something real. Because sometimes love means knowing when to let go. Because sometimes the person who loves you most is the one brave enough to walk away, and you're going to forget about this. About me. And that's going to be okay. That's how people work. I won't, Elvis said. Yes, you will, Margaret said. She wasn't unkind. She was just certain, and that's not a tragedy. That's just how love works sometimes. It's real while it's happening. It teaches you something real, and then it ends, and you carry it with you, and you become a different person because of it. That's the actual gift. Not forever. Just the change. By late March, Elvis had begun noticing one of the other soldiers' friends, a girl named Priscilla, younger, much younger, 14, though she looked older. She was American, living with her family on base, and she looked at Elvis the way he'd become accustomed to people looking at him, like he was impossible, like he was a dream that had taken human form. It was everything Margaret had warned him about. He didn't pursue it, not consciously. But he stopped trying to save things with Margaret. The relationship ended not with a fight or a dramatic goodbye, but with a slow fading. By April, they barely spoke. By May, she'd been transferred to another base liaison position. By June, she was gone, and Elvis was alone with the knowledge of what he'd lost. What he carried from Margaret was different from heartbreak. It was knowledge. For the first time, Elvis understood that his fame wasn't just a barrier to connection. It was a fundamentally different thing than he was. You could love the symbol. You could love the person. But the two rarely occupied the same space, and people who tried to love both usually ended up loving neither. That realization would haunt him in different forms for the rest of his life. It was the most important thing anyone ever taught him, and it cost him the one person who mattered enough to teach it. Notice what he learned, that sometimes losing someone teaches you more than keeping them ever could. In his remaining months in Germany, Elvis would sometimes return to the officers' club, looking for her, but she was truly gone. He asked the other staff if they knew where she'd transferred to, but they didn't, or wouldn't tell him. Eventually, he stopped asking. When his service ended in 1960, Elvis stood on the same platform in Bremerhaven where he'd arrived. The ocean looked the same. The machinery of the military moved around him with the same precision. Tick, tick, tick. But he was different now. The invisibility was gone. The magazines had followed him even into the army. The fame had found him even in the one place he'd hoped to lose it. And he'd had to give it up anyway, not because he chose to, but because the person who saw him clearly had decided that clarity was a mercy, only if she removed herself from the equation. He never saw Margaret again. In the years that followed, when people asked him about his time in the army, he'd talk about the discipline, the character building, the importance of serving his country. All of which was true. He was proud of his service. But he never mentioned the German girl who'd taught him that fame was a poor substitute for being known. That lesson, unlike his records, didn't belong in interviews or public record. It belonged to the quiet, ordinary part of himself that he'd learned to protect, the part that Margaret had briefly seen, and then, out of mercy perhaps, released back into privacy. Years later, historians tried to find her. They dug through records, interviewed people who'd been stationed at Bad Nauheim, tried to reconstruct the story. But Margaret had lived quietly and died quietly, and by the time people cared enough to look, she'd already chosen not to be found. There were rumors. Some people claimed her name was actually Margot. Others said she was Swedish, not German. A few insisted she'd been an officer's secretary, not a club worker. The details blurred. The story became myth. But Elvis knew the truth. He carried it with him. And in his most honest moments, the ones that usually came late at night when he was alone, he understood what Margaret had understood, that the story belonged to him, not to the world. That sometimes the most important people in your life are the ones nobody ever hears about. That sometimes the greatest love isn't about forever, it's about allowing someone to be human in a world determined to make them legendary. The irony of his life was that everyone knew Elvis Presley, but the people who'd actually known him, really known him, were few, and nearly all of them, like Margaret, had eventually stepped away. Because you can't hold on to someone who's become a symbol. You can only watch them leave and be grateful you saw them when they were still a person. That's what the 18 months in Germany taught him. That's what he never quite forgot. And that's the story nobody knows, not because it's secret, but because it matters too much to be made into something public, because some knowledge is only true if it remains private, because sometimes the greatest gift someone can give you is the mercy of leaving you with something real,